Which Zelda timeline has the greatest future, the most promise, or the longest stage of prosperity? Each has its respected share of dread, despair, and well, shit. But with the defeat of an evil, we usually witness a somewhat peaceful era for at least 100 years or so, until another demonic presence creeps forth from the eternal darkness, that is, the Curse of Demise. But is there a branch of history that bounces back from tragedy a little more gracefully than the other two? Or are they all equally screwed? What's up guys, it's Edible Incredible, and today I'll be briefly diving into each of the three Zelda realities, and comparing the amount of doo-doo each have to flush. So let's begin with how the timelines diverged. For those of you that don't fully grasp the way the timelines split, or just haven't attempted to dive into the lore, I'll try to simplify it for you. So the titles Child and Adult Timeline are referring directly to the two versions of Link from Ocarina. The adult timeline follows suit with the sealing of Ganondorf by the hands of adult Link and the sages. Afterwards, Zelda sends Link back 7 years to regain his lost time. This is what creates the split between the adult and child timelines. Without the blood of the hero in the adult timeline, Ganon eventually re-emerges to wreak havoc. The King of Hyrule has no choice but to plead to the gods. The gods listen, but decide to flood the lands, aka the Great Flood. That sets up the Wind Waker. So that's the adult timeline in a nutshell. The child timeline stems from Link returning to his original time to conclude Ocarina. With knowledge of future events, he warns Princess Zelda of Ganon's true intent, and then seeks to find his beloved Navi that just mysteriously left. Upon his return to this reality, he decides to search the Lost Woods, a place he and Navi knew super well, but finds himself transported to the troubled lands of Termina. While this is going on, the royal family is able to capture Ganon and send him to the Twilight Realm, setting up Twilight Princess. And last but not least, the downfall timeline split is probably the easiest to understand. Link dies to Ganon, but the sages are still able to seal him. However, without Link's help, they're only able to seal him in the Sacred Realm, a place that Ganon is able to corrupt leading up to the events of A Link to the Past. And bam, that's the famous timeline split. Of course, there's more juicy details that people love to speculate about, but that's the premise. And with that out of the way, let's now dive deep. So on paper, the downfall timeline seems to hold the most reoccurring casualties, with the number of times Ganon reappears. But the adult timeline has its one massive tragedy in the Great Flood, and the child timeline has the highly speculated bloody Gerudo Hylian War. At the very end of each timeline in Hyrule Historia, we get a potential glimpse at the future of these realities. For the child timeline, it reads, "Will the light world never be free of the threat of darkness? There may come a time when the land will have need of the Four Sword once again." Now of course this is in direct response to the last game in this era, being Four Swords Adventures, and setting up a spot on the timeline for if they ever decide to create more Four Swords games. The Twilight Realm and Twilight Princess could also correlate with this quote, since it is another time in this same reality where a light and dark world coincide. At the end of the adult timeline, it reads, "With the lineage of the gods not yet exhausted, who can say what successive generations will bring? The story will continue to unfold. The lineage of the gods, meaning the blood of the goddess Hylia, still lives on with this reality's Princess Zelda." And to conclude the downfall timeline, it reads, "Did generations pass full of peace and the light of prosperity? Or did the curtain rise on an age of darkness when people quarreled in their search for power? The future of this timeline has yet to be unraveled." This timeline stems from the Imprisoning War, where people were in hot pursuit for the Triforce in the Sacred Realm. Their greed and curiosity urged them into this realm, where they heard dwelled the Triforce. But instead they were welcomed by Ganon, who twisted the realm into darkness, and no one that entered was able to return to the world of the living. So now I'm gonna let my fellow Sheikah Squad members give their 2 cents in discussing which timeline they believe has the greatest potential future. Firstly, here's Tyler Townsend.
The adult timeline has a huge amount of potential. With the introduction of Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, we saw the world open up immensely. While Link and Tetra ultimately settled in New Hyrule, the era of the Great Voyage could see many new lands and stories to tell before they arrived at their new settlement. Additionally, we've only scratched the surface of New Hyrule. With Bellum and Malladus, we got to see what new evils exist outside the Triforce of Power, and that other creatures of evil are out there. I would love for Nintendo to continue to explore new villains and to open up the world a bit more beyond the traditional Zelda tropes. The industrialization that we see in Spirit Tracks lends itself greatly to the possibility of a more futuristic Zelda game. We've seen Nintendo hint at this in concept art, especially for Breath of the Wild. Link with an electric guitar and motorcycle, as well as the alien invasion of Hyrule concept, show that they've at least considered the option before. I think now, especially with the boom and popularity of the Cyberpunk genre, that a neon synthwave futuristic Zelda could possess untold potential.
And now for Xenogamer.
The Fallen Hero timeline. The best outcome of the Zelda series? I know what you're thinking. I'm insane. And I mean, yeah, probably, but there is something about this path of constant conflict that can bring forth a brighter future than the other 2 outcomes, ending the cycle of Demise's curse. Skyward Sword made it its mission to explain the Zelda series continuity better by providing it with a backstory. It attempts to give context to the many staples of Zelda games, whether it be the origin of the world of Hyrule, Princess Zelda, or even the Master Sword. By the end of the game, you hear from the series' original villain, Demise, an explanation attempting to tie the constant emergence of new threats in Hyrule to him. A pretty decent way to explain why Ganondorf and co. keep returning again and again, but it's the extra details in Demise's curse that I can't seem to stop fixating on. Those like you, those who share the blood of the goddess and the spirit of the hero, they are eternally bound to this curse. Notice how it doesn't say all of Hyrule. It doesn't say all of the world. The curse singles out the blood of the goddess, the descendants of the royal family of Hyrule, and the spirit of the hero, the many links. So logically, based on the wording here, that would mean if both the royal family and Link were all to die, the curse would along with them. And Ganondorf, at the beginning of the Fallen timeline, gets halfway there, before Zelda and the sages seal him, ensuring the next several games of the cycle play out. By the end of this timeline, the adventure of Link, Ganondorf has been defeated, but there are still those driven to madness that will continue to attempt reviving him, and they will succeed because the curse still lives. Basically, my point here is that are any of the timelines really blessed with a happy ending if the curse hasn't been broken by the end of any of them? The Fallen timeline isn't the best outcome for the Zelda series, but it very easily could have been if the cards had lined up a little better. None of these timelines have truly happy endings though, and they never will until this curse is lifted.
And next, here's Newbornkilik.
Hey there friendos, Newbornkilik here, and when Edible asked me what I thought the most promising timeline was, my mind immediately went to the Downfall timeline. Now I know, that's strange. Newbornkilik, why in the world would the Downfall timeline, the one where the hero fell at one of the most critical of moments, possibly be the brightest future? I think, simply put, for that answer, we have to look no further than the actual Zelda timeline and page 107 of the Hyrule Historia. First, looking at page 107 of the Hyrule Historia, we see the line during the Golden Era. Ever since the crushing defeat of the Demon King Ganon, each successive generation of Hylian kings used the Triforce of power, wisdom, and courage passed down by the royal family to preserve order in the land. Here's the important part. Those who wielded the Triforce were required to possess the unique characteristics of having been born with a heart free from wickedness. Honestly, just the thought right there of them only putting in the kind-hearted leaders was really stuck out to me after actually doing some research for this. It almost fills you with a lot of hope. Swinging over to the timeline, we actually see that the only threat to this timeline has basically been Ganon being revived. There is a lot of solace in knowing exactly what your threat is going to be. It's going to be Ganon, like clockwork. Every, couple hundred years, Ganon's coming back. And at the end, we actually see them adapt to this. And in the adventure of Link, Ganon's revival is actually prevented. To quote Nayru, the Downfall timeline has dealt with Ganon's threat more than any other timeline. They've gotten pretty efficient at it. And to that end, I couldn't agree more. In the last installment of the timeline, as I said, we see them prevent Ganon from even coming to be in the first place. Bringing this kind of into the real world here, we note a lot of great inventions are made during times of hardship. Think World War II, we actually got synthetic rubber, one of the main things that we use in a lot of things nowadays. Not to mention synthetic oil, which is also very important, along with penicillin. Those were times when humanity was basically stressed so much they had to come up with an alternative. They had no other choice. It was evolve or die. In reality, this is the exact same kind of situation that they were put in after the hero fell. The king being chosen to be pure of heart every single time. No exceptions are made on this, to my knowledge. The king must be pure of heart is one of the best adaptations. And in fact, in my opinion, along with knowing what your threat is going to be and knowing how to prevent it, gives the Downfall timeline one of the brightest futures in my opinion.
And last but not least, here's Nayru.
The heart of a naive child turned dark. The shade of a hero left without recognition. A world covered in twilight. The return and resurrection of the Demon King, and the arrival of a new threat. The child era is not a hopeful timeline. It is bleak, humanity is struggling, barely surviving from one threat to the next. It is seemingly a timeline of misery with no end. Hello everybody, my name is Nayru, fellow Sheikah squad member with Edible Incredible, and I'm here to shine a single ray of hope into the desolate darkness of the child timeline. It is undeniable that those existing in the child timeline have it rough. The adult timeline is one of excitement, as Hyrule refounds itself on an entirely new continent. The decline timeline sees humanity cast aside the goddesses almost entirely and pave a path on their own resolve. The child era honestly doesn't have a lot going for it. It's a timeline where evil is never really beaten, in fact it often succeeds. It shows the problems with over-reliance on divine intervention, and it shows how rotten absolute monarchy can become. Well-intentioned hearts are tremendously corruptible. But despite this seemingly never-ending depression, the child timeline has one glimmering symbol of hope, one ray of light that the other timelines lack. A single force which assures that no matter how hopeless the future may seem, there will always be hope for Hyrule. The child timeline has the legendary Picori blade, the Four Sword. Surely the Four Sword exists in all three timelines, it was introduced before the split. But as of yet, the child timeline is the only timeline in which it has reappeared. At the end of the child timeline, we're left with a Ganon that is currently sealed inside the Four Sword, and he theoretically shouldn't be able to escape. But remember, the Master Sword is confirmed to exist as well, as obviously seen in Twilight Princess. This means that there are two active legendary blades in existence in the child timeline. The Four Sword currently sealing Ganon, and the Master Sword resting in the Sacred Grove. This means if Ganon somehow escapes the Four Sword, the new incarnation of Link will then be free to use it. And that means Link could, theoretically, have access to the powers of both the Master Sword and the Four Sword. Imagine Link with the blade of the goddess in one hand and the blade of the Picori in the other. The ability to split into four while still having the power of the Master Sword. Ganon would face a Link with unparalleled power. What the existence of the Four Sword also means is that even if Ganon remains sealed in the Four Sword and Link is unable to use it, and a new threat attacks Hyrule, Link is free to use the Master Sword against it because the Master Sword isn't being used to seal Ganon this time. The child timeline feels desolate and hopeless, and in many ways it is. The people who exist in that timeline have a lot to worry about, but one thing they don't have to worry about is an underpowered Link. Maybe there's hope for the child timeline after all.
Well, and that's that. Opinions for each reality. Let me know which you believe may have the brightest future. Thanks again to my fellow Sheikah Squad crew for helping your boy out. I'll be sure to link all their sexy channels down below. As always, I hope you all stay hyped. And we are the Sheikah Squad, going dark.